at Work, Effective Strategies for Successful Resolution, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Martin Delahoussaye. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the chat box. We will answer questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Martin has more than 25 years of experience in publishing, with a specific focus on training and development. As Vice President of Publishing for HRDQ, Martin leads the organization's strategic content acquisition initiatives, as well as the research and development of new products. Previously, Martin served as a Senior Acquisitions Editor for Pfeiffer, Managing Editor of Training Magazine, and Editor of Training Journal. In addition, Martin held several operational positions at McGraw-Hill and Gower Publishing in Great Britain prior to becoming President of Orange House Publishing in Australia. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Martin.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for that very warm introduction, Sarah. I spend most of my time behind the scenes directing content development for HRDQ, and so I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you today about a topic that is not usually looked on in a positive light: conflict. We recently updated and revised an assessment tool called Conflict Strategies Inventory, and some of the content I present today is drawn from this. During this presentation, we will explore the nature of conflict, and specifically I will introduce 5 approaches, or strategies as we call them, for dealing with and managing conflict at work. We'll examine when and how to best make use of one strategy in particular, which we call the integrating strategy. We'll also explore the circumstances and situations in which one of the other 4 strategies may be more appropriate to make use of. And finally, we'll take a look at a process we can use to help others improve their conflict management skills. Conflict is something that we have to deal with, but I'm sure many of us wish we didn't. When we do encounter conflict, some of us shy away from it. Others grab it by the horns. It can make us feel uncomfortable, and our personalities can sometimes dictate how we respond to it. And some people seem much better at handling conflict than others. So people understandably can develop an aversion to conflict. The traditional view of conflict is that it's a productivity drain, right up there with notable productivity killers like absenteeism. But unlike absenteeism, which can be relatively easily measured, conflict and its effects on retention, engagement, stress, productivity and performance is not so easily understood. But thankfully there are some studies out there that have been carried out to help us quantify the costs of conflict at work. One 2008 study, and the source for this is shown at the bottom of this slide, reveals, for example, that workers devote almost 3 hours a week to dealing with conflict. Put another way, this equates to a whopping 385 million working days. Now, as we will see throughout this presentation, time spent dealing with conflict isn't necessarily lost time, but clearly some percentage of this number represents lost productivity at work. The majority of us will experience conflict within our own teams or within or between other teams on a fairly regular basis. As much as 81% of employees experience some conflict at work, according to one study. And so prevalent is conflict in the workplace that it seems the only way you can guarantee not to come into conflict is to simply avoid other people altogether. And as our employees are engaged in conflict, supervisors are required to manage and mediate between the parties. Another study, this time from 2005, revealed managers devote as much as 2 days a week to resolving conflicts of one sort or another. And so with all this conflict around, with all this time spent either in or managing conflict, what does this actually mean for the workplace? Let me start with a rhetorical question. Did you wake up this morning hoping you will experience some conflict today? I'm guessing probably not, and for good reason. There are some genuinely negative outcomes that flow from conflict when it is ill-managed or not addressed at all. Just direct your attention to the screen, of course, and see the outcomes that we've identified as part of the research into conflict resolution at work. I put trust at the top of this list as it's foundational to healthy working relationships. Conflict can easily unravel the trust people have in each other or the organizations in which they work. People also feel less inclined to cooperate when they are in conflict with others. And when taken to extremes, conflict can lead to increased stress and all the associated negative effects that this can bring. Conflict can also lead to delays, missed deadlines, poor decisions, and misuse of resources. And sadly, if it becomes too intense, conflict can cause people to seek alternative employment. So what's missing from this list? Well, I invite you to use your chat window now and tell us about some of the other negative consequences of conflict that you've personally experienced at work. I'm seeing poor morale, low morale, poor relationships, irritability, physical limitations, unaccepting of new employees, health issues, lack of trust again, increased conflict. So I'm seeing quite a lot of similar themes here around, mostly to do with its effects on people, a little less to do with its effects on the process and work itself. Actual physical contact, absenteeism is another casualty of conflict. So as you can see, there are quite a number of negative outcomes that flow from poorly managed conflict at work. Sadly, conflict is both natural and inevitable. And despite the prevalence of conflict in the workplace, we still have difficulty recognizing, understanding, and managing it. But there may well be some benefits to conflict, as well as some of the negative outcomes that we've just discussed. So instead of trying to avoid or eliminate conflict, we now try to understand how to handle it and under what circumstances it can be beneficial. Once again, I just use your chat window to share your ideas for when you believe conflict can be beneficial at work. Okay, it's a problem solver, growth opportunity. I'm seeing increased energy, innovation, open dialogue, generating new ideas, creativity. So I'm seeing some similar themes around its impact on people working together, increased team effectiveness, innovation, creativity. Thank you. That's an exceptionally good list. And it will help us add to the list that we identified during the research for the conflict strategies inventory on some of the positive outcomes that we get. Obviously, trust, teamwork, creativity, and productivity can all be improved when conflict is managed well. So having looked at some of the negative effects and potential benefits that are a consequence of conflict, we can now start to look at how we can minimize those negatives and achieve some of the positive outcomes when we inevitably encounter conflict at work. As a starting point for managing conflict, it's useful to understand what it is and how it begins. Now here's a definition of conflict that we use. The situation that occurs when parties with contrasting goals, values, or expectations come in contact with one another. Now, as discussed, we typically define conflict in a negative sense, and for many of us, conflict is synonymous with something that is detrimental. But as we see in this definition, there is opportunity in having people with different values, goals, and expectations working together. Frankly, if there are 3 of us on a team with very similar values, goals, and expectations, then 2 of us are not really adding additional value. Conflict, then, as we see it, presents us with opportunities to create value out of difference. And when we begin to view it through this lens, it becomes a powerful source of creativity and innovation. One source of conflict stems from people not getting along, and we saw many of those consequences in the list of negatives that you contributed a little earlier in this presentation. We call this relationship conflict. One study puts the source of conflict due to strained relationships at 60 to 80%. Relationship conflict can be the most difficult to manage and overcome, as it often involves values or beliefs which can be immutable. And if you consider how we work with others, consider one person who insists on punctuality, for example, likely to feel rather ruffled when working with someone who regularly turns up late for meetings. Whereas other types of conflict tend to be more situational, relationship conflict can affect almost all interactions. And unless they are addressed, relationship differences can simmer and potentially draw in others, further escalating the conflict. The other source of conflict is what we call workflow conflict, and this comprises two slightly different types. Task conflict, which is what you might typically experience in terms of conflicts of priority, and process conflict, which is a conflict or difference in how things are done. Task conflicts arise over competing priorities, goals, or different views on where resources should be used. And when organizational goals cascade down to the level of the team or individual, it's not uncommon or unusual for tasks or priorities to come into conflict. Process conflict, on the other hand, is a slightly different form of conflict and can be as much about ideas as anything else. A marketing manager might favor a print campaign to launch a new product, whereas a sales manager prefers a series of launch events. Conflicts around how things are done can be seemingly minor, or they can involve major points of difference. So what is your experience of conflict? Take a look at the three types of conflict that we've just introduced, the relationship conflict, task conflict, and process conflict, and ask yourself if there is one type among these three that you experience more often than the other two. So here is a question, and here are your three possible responses. And I think we're about to launch the poll to help you respond to this. Okay, well, I'm seeing an exceptionally good response to this question, and unsurprisingly, at least according to the research that we've conducted and that others have conducted, 52% of you responded that relationship conflict is the conflict that you most often encounter in the workplace. Second, at 31%, was process conflict over ideas and how things are done. And last, but not insignificant, 17% of you said that you encounter task conflict more often than not. Well, thank you for that. We're now closing that poll. So if you take an academic interest in conflict, you will discover the most modern theories of conflict are based on Robert Blake and Jane Mooton's research on conflict management during the 1960s. Together, Blake and Mooton identified 5 characteristic ways, or what they call styles, that people use to respond to conflict. The 5 styles, forcing, withdrawing, smoothing, compromising, and problem solving, are based on an individual's degree of concern or focus for production or task on the y-axis, and the degree of concern for people on the x-axis. HRDQ's conflict strategies model is a modified version of the Blake and Mooton conflict grid. We use the term strategies rather than styles because we feel how we handle conflict can be an intentional decision. We also adapted the term competing rather than forcing, and avoiding rather than withdrawing, as we felt these were softer terms to use for developmental purposes. And we renamed problem solving to integrating because we felt that was a more descriptive term for the behaviors involved. And as you can see, smoothing and compromising remained unchanged. Now, regardless of which particular strategy you adopt to manage conflict, you will go through two stages. In stage one, two or more parties realize that their goals are incompatible. For instance, one party may want to spend less on a project while the other party wants expensive, high-quality deliverables. And then they have to decide how to handle these differences. And it's what we call the strategy decision. And this leads then to stage two, where their goals are either met or unmet. In many ways, the strategy decision, whether this is made consciously or unconsciously, is the crucial step. Conflict resolution skills obviously play a part, but adopting the wrong strategy to begin with has by far the greatest effect on the outcome. So let's take a look at these 5 conflict strategies in more detail. The avoiding strategy is when one party ignores their own goals by steering clear of the conflict. Avoiding is the complete lack of engagement in the conflict itself. For instance, one person wants lower costs but chooses not to vocalize this expectation. In doing so, they concede their position entirely, leaving their goal unmet, while person A has his or her goals fully met. In smoothing, one person gives in completely to the other party's goals, but unlike the avoiding strategy, smoothing involves engaging in the conflict, but simply results in giving up one's original goals or expectations in favor of supporting the other person's goals. In this example, person B makes it known to party A that they want high-quality deliverables, but chooses to forego this expectation in favor of supporting A's goal of achieving lower costs. The competing strategy produces the classic win-lose situation. Party A will achieve their original goal while Party B loses everything. The outcome, as you'll see, is the same as avoiding and smoothing, but both parties stand their ground until one person emerges as the winner. The compromising strategy is one that many of us will be familiar with. It's a solution that includes pieces of the parties' original goals. For instance, the parties agree to cut costs on some deliverables, yet spend more on higher quality, more for higher quality on others. It can be satisfying for both parties, and indeed may help protect the relationship or enable the parties to reach an outcome quickly, if this is desirable. Ultimately, though, compromising may be more about making the parties feel good than it is about producing an outcome that benefits the organization as a whole. The integrating strategy involves both parties working together to find a solution that produces the best outcome for the organization. For instance, continuing our example, the parties find a way to save money and maintain high-quality deliverables. Now, integrating has significant benefits over the other conflict strategies. The parties reach a mutually advantageous solution that not only meets but also can surpass their original goals. The solution is usually long-term in focus and benefits the organization as a whole. And perhaps more importantly, by resolving the conflict in a positive, collaborative manner, the parties maintain a strong relationship and set the tone for future issues to be handled in a similar way. Now, in case you're wondering whether integrating is the prescribed cure-all for conflict situations, is that really the case? Should integrating always be your go-to method of conflict resolution, or are there other situations in which the other strategies may be more effective? So the avoiding strategy, which is one that's usually ineffective because the conflict remains even if you aren't dealing with it. However, it's likely there are some situations in which the conflict is so trivial or the views are so strongly held that they simply cannot be resolved. And so avoiding can help prevent unnecessary problems. The smoothing strategy may create the impression that the smoother is easily persuaded. I love that term. And in the long run, their ideas may not be taken seriously. However, the smoothing can sometimes be the key strategy to use in order to move beyond the conflict at hand. And sometimes it gives you a bigger gain in the future for the cost of only a small loss today. Competing is rarely a productive strategy for dealing with conflict because it obviously takes a hit in terms of relationships. However, it can be an appropriate strategy if there is no long-term relationship involved or if one of the parties' goals demands immediate attention. Conflicts that arise during one-off negotiations, for example, may benefit from adopting a competing strategy. The compromising strategy is one that people often adopt when there is a need to move forward quickly. In the compromising strategy, both parties are trying to satisfy as much of their original goals as possible. But they do this at the risk of not searching for the best overall solution. Compromising, however, can be effective when parties are at a stalemate. And so we come back to the integrating strategy. Although each of the 5 strategies is appropriate in different situations, research indicates that in general, integrating is the most beneficial strategy because it focuses on problem solving and collaboration. It's also an effective strategy for dealing with conflict because it frames the conflict in terms of what is best for the organization and protects the parties' relationship. It is challenging though, because it can take time for the best solutions to emerge. Now I have a personal example of the integrating strategy that I'd like to share with you. In the early part of my career, I used to attend a small book fair each year, as did a colleague of mine from the same editorial team. One year we were told that budgets were tight and only one of us could attend. We both immediately went into compete mode. We each saw attendance as a status symbol and felt once we gave up going one year, we'd unlikely to be able to ever go again and we'd take a hit on our career prospects. So as we discussed our respective goals and outcomes from the fair over the next few days, we came to the realization that neither of us gained much from the event. We went because that's what editors from our company always did. We enjoyed the travel, of course, but that was really a personal gain. Once at the fair, we rarely met anyone of note and could not recall any significant benefit going back over the last few years. Now, we might have reached a compromise solution where one of us went to the conference each year and with perhaps some lingering resentment. But the solution we ended up with was the best for the organization as a whole. Rather than limiting attendance to one editor, we recommended to our supervisor that neither of us go. And in fact, we should not include this in the budget ever again. So we ended up with an integrated solution that not only saved that year's travel expense, but future years also. So that's the personal example I have of using the integrating strategy to resolve a conflict. So if we want to pursue getting better at and more adept at using the integrating strategy, what can we do? Well, clearly when you focus on what's best for the organization, you go a long way to creating a climate of trust. When you can see the conflict from other sides, you're able to surface and clarify thoughts and feelings. Communication channels will open up, and creativity and innovation, which were a rather common response to the question earlier about the benefits of conflict at work, really can come into play and the solutions can expand. And ultimately, we remove many of the impediments to inefficiency. So how do we become better at using the integrating strategy? Well, the key to making conflict work for you rather than against you is to first recognize the value in other people's views and to reframe the conflict in terms of positive benefits to the organization. These are the foundations for the integrating strategy. And here are some pointers for making that integrating strategy work for you. As we discussed, begin by being open and honest about your goal or expectations, and invite the other party to do the same. Always look at the big picture. What would be the best outcome for the organization, regardless of what you want and what the other party wants? That's actually quite a challenge for people to get past when they start thinking in terms of the organizational benefit rather than their own personal benefit. It helps to stay calm and non-defensive, and if you do that, you inspire the other party to adopt a similar mindset and set the stage for problem solving and collaboration. It also helps to ask questions to make sure that you fully understand the other party's goals and values. And of course, putting yourself in the other party's shoes helps you to view the conflict from their perspective. And as we discussed earlier, reframing the conflict as an opportunity to improve something rather than an obstacle to overcome can help you move towards an integrated solution. And whether that opportunity to improve is a process, structure, or relationship, framing it in that positive way will certainly get you closer to an ultimate solution than you otherwise might be. And similarly, view the other party as a partner in solving this rather than as an adversary to be beaten. Now, this wouldn't be a development process if we didn't have steps involved. And so in terms of when we talk about developing in the context of conflict, what we're trying to focus on is helping people understand their natural response to it and helping them to recognize when that response needs to be adjusted. And so a useful first step is to identify your primary conflict strategy. That is, how do you typically respond to a conflict situation? An assessment tool will help put a mirror on your conflict behaviors and help you understand how you respond to conflict as a starting point for developing your conflict management skills. You may have some habitual habits for types of scenarios that cause you to default to one conflict strategy over another. And there are likely situations in which this conflict strategy will work well and situations where it will be less effective. And so in step 2, we ask you to reflect on how effective your primary response to conflict has been, which will help you shed light on changes that you could potentially make. Another similar but slightly different technique is to make a list of common conflict situations or types you encounter at work, then identify which conflict strategy is most likely to result in an optimal outcome. This step is actually really helpful because it begins the process of helping people to think about how they could modify their response to conflict, which of course is the starting point for change. In step 4, we're now beginning to target some change behaviors and determining what it is we'll do differently in our response to conflict. This is a major step, and as anyone involved in the development of others will know, once you start beginning to target what you will do differently, you begin to change the neural pathways in terms of what you think about, how you think about the process that you're trying to improve. And of course, we want to put some practice in there. If we're talking about behavior, these behaviors improve only through application. And so we want to help you create new patterns of response. And to do this, establishing a feedback loop can be really helpful, particularly in the early stages of behavior change. Now, there are many forms of feedback loop, but they include seeking input from other parties, observation from peers and colleagues, and general reflective activity, which will be both useful in supporting your efforts to change and helping you quantify the processes that the progress that you're making. Now, it seems appropriate that as we're talking about practice, I give you an opportunity to apply some of what you've learned during this presentation. On the next slide, you are going to be presented with a near to real life conflict situation, and as I read this to you, I'd like you to consider how you would handle this scenario. So here's the situation. You and Larry are old friends. You both started working at this company right out of school and have moved up the ranks at a relatively even rate. You in research and he in marketing. Larry was assigned to work with you and your department on a 4-month project because of a recent downsizing and restructuring of departments. You told your co-workers what a great guy Larry is, and they really look forward to meeting him. After 2 weeks on the project, your co-workers approached you with complaints about Larry. They claimed he was obnoxious, overbearing, and difficult to work with. You assured them that he just comes across a little strong, but deep down he really is a decent person and a hard worker. You mentioned these complaints to Larry, and he feels your co-workers are uncooperative. Recently, they approached you again with the same complaints, saying that Larry hasn't changed and in fact he's getting harder to tolerate. So how would you handle the conflict? Here are your possible responses. Option A, tell your co-workers that they won't have to work with Larry after this project is over and ask that they just try and put up with him for a little longer. Option B, keep yourself out of the middle of this problem. You don't want to damage your friendship with Larry or hurt your working relationships with the department. Option C, suggest to Larry that he should be a little more conservative in his actions with the group. At the same time, you will tell the department to be a little more patient while Larry is adapting to the group. Option D, schedule a meeting with Larry and the co-workers involved, in which both parties can talk about their working relationship and discuss what behaviors will promote more effective interaction among them. Option E, stick by your friend and tell your co-workers that you think they are being unfair simply because he's new. Tell them you won't hesitate to go to your supervisor if they aren't more cooperative. And now I think we can launch the poll. Okay, so as we close in on a majority of you having voted, I'm seeing option D as the clear winner in this scenario, followed by option C. Options A and B got very small responses and nobody chose option E. Very interesting response. So at one level, it makes me feel very pleased, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's talk about this relationship conflict. Option A, tell your co-workers that they won't have to work with Larry after this project is over and ask that they just try and put up with him for a little longer. This is the smoothing strategy. Now this would be fine if only your concern was for future projects, but it ignores the present. Even if the rest of the department would agree to pretend that the problem doesn't really exist, it is still there and it's affecting productivity. Option B, you can keep yourself out of the middle of this problem. You don't want to damage relationship with your friendship with Larry or hurt your working relationship with the department. I think as most of you will have guessed, this is the avoiding strategy. The reasons given for not getting involved in this conflict are the exact reasons you should be involved. If you turn your back on this conflict, you could damage your friendship, and there is a good chance you will drastically hurt your working relationship. You are the common ground between the two sides in this conflict, and so avoiding is really not an option you want to exercise here. Option C, you could suggest to Larry that he be a little more conservative in his actions with the group, and at the same time, you'll tell the department to be a little more patient with Larry while he is adapting to the group. This is the compromising strategy. When you decide to address a conflict by speaking to the parties separately, the problem of their lack of communication has still not been addressed. The conflict in this situation centers around the interaction between Larry and the group, and so should the solution. Which brings us to option D. Schedule a meeting with Larry and the co-workers involved in which both parties can talk about their working relationship and discuss what behaviors will promote more effective interaction among them. As 76% of you surmised, this is the optimal strategy for this particular conflict situation. The integrating solution brings the two parties together to decide collectively what will be best for all involved. And by bringing the conflict out into the open, the individuals are given a chance to express what they see as the problem. It's crucial that Larry and your co-workers solve this problem in an interactive manner. And finally, option E. Now, none of you chose this option, and so you can all feel good about that. This is the competing strategy. Sticking by your friend and telling your co-workers that you think they're being unfair simply because he's new. You won't hesitate to go to your supervisor if they aren't more cooperative. Sticking by your friend might seem a good idea in a non-work related situation, but it is definitely not recommended in a conflict between people at work, and especially people who happen to be friends. Someone's going to win and someone is going to lose, and that is rarely the best way to resolve any conflict. Well, I hope you found that practice fun. I certainly found it interesting seeing your responses to it. And it does in fact bring the presentation part of today's session to an end. But I believe we have some time remaining for questions. Sarah?
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Martin. And we actually do have some time for some questions. So attendees, if you want to go ahead and chat that into the window right now. And while we wait for those questions to come in, let me share a little bit about the program that is the foundation of today's session. And if you could just advance to the next slide. All right, great. Thank you so much. And that is Conflict Strategies Inventory. And this is a soft skills training program on conflict management strategies. The assessment identifies an individual's preferred conflict strategy, examines each strategy, and enables individuals to develop an action plan to put learning into action. You can use your coupon code you receive in the mail after the session at HRDQ-store.com, and you can also try that 30 days risk-free. So, okay, and it looks like we actually do have a number of questions coming in, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Our first question is coming from Mark, and he would like to know, how do I persuade others that conflict can have a positive impact in the workplace?
Well, that's a great question. I might start by suggesting you seek out the International Journal of Conflict Management, only because they have a ton of resources on research into conflict and how prevalent it is and what particular types of conflict are more prevalent than others in the workplace. You may have to do a bit of digging around on the website, and they do have a journal as well if that's something that you're interested in. In our own research into the topic, we uncovered research that found a certain amount of conflict is healthy for an organization, and it's useful to cite this research as part of your efforts to persuade other people, because it's then not you telling them it should work, it's you citing others who've researched this topic. For example, we found that the intergroup and interpersonal differences present in organizations that breed conflict also produce debate, alternative solutions, and creative ideas and change. And although there are no exact percentages or numbers on how much time we should spend resolving conflict, we certainly have found that a moderate amount of conflict handled in a constructive manner is essential in the workplace for attaining and maintaining optimal levels of performance. I hope that helps.
All right, great. Thank you. And looks like our next question is from Kenneth, and he wants to know, how many of the negative outcomes of conflict are due to a misunderstanding of the value of conflict?
That's an interesting question, and I wouldn't be able to answer that in with a number or a percentage. But I'd certainly think that how we view conflict, and certainly when we're beginning and starting point is looking at conflict as adversarial, which many people believe it is, does color our views of conflict. So I think a starting point is to help people come to a realization that conflict is a good thing, and that it can not only help resolve situations that come to a head at work, but also in the process of resolving conflict has all these attendant benefits that go with it. So I would say a starting point is helping people sort of jump the shark, as it were, and become much more positively oriented towards conflict.
All right, great. Thank you. And it looks like our next one is coming from Pat, and he wants to know, I am still unclear as to the difference between the strategies of avoiding and smoothing. Can you please explain?
Yes, I can explain. If you remember back in the presentation, avoiding is the complete lack of engagement in the conflict. The person who you may have been in conflict with doesn't even know that you actually had an expectation, because you don't vocalize and make those expectations known. You simply retire to a safe distance. Now, as I've said, sometimes that's a good thing, because not every conflict is worth engaging in. But that's the avoiding is the complete lack of engagement. The smoothing is being involved in the conflict and giving up your position, as it were. And sometimes you might give up that position for political reasons. You may decide, well, I'll lose this one today, but it keeps me in the game, and I'm now able to potentially meet my expectations further on down the line. So one is a complete lack of engagement in the conflict. The other is a choice not to be involved.
All right, great. Thank you. And our next one is from Marcy, and she wants to know, how do you handle conflicts that are with the same person and are competitive based?
How do you handle conflict
that are with the same person?
That are constantly with the same person.
Mm-hmm. And are competitive based.
Well, many conflicts appear to be competitive based anyway. I would go back to the list that we showed on how you become more adept at integrating. And that is to start out with articulating what each of your particular goals are and listening to the other person and trying to identify what's the big picture here. It seems in a conflict situation that you are shooting for personal goals, and it helps to elevate the conversation above that to, well, what's best for the organization? Put aside what I want and what you want. How does the organization benefit if we do X, Y, or Z in this particular case? So I would suggest going back to the list that we showed on the slideshow of the things you can do to become more adept at integrating, and look at that list and start applying some of those suggestions to elevate the conversation away from the personal and into the organizational.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is coming from James, and he asks, I think using the term resolution gives a sense of competing right off the bat. Don't you feel as though management is better terminology to use? The only reason I ask is because you referred to resolution a few times. That's
actually a very good point, and I do know that in the the world of publishing, we often use synonyms, and resolution is often used as a synonym for managing. But I agree with you, I think resolution is a little bit more of a loaded term. And certainly, if I were ever to deliver this presentation again, I might modify that now on the basis of this feedback. So thank you. I appreciate that observation.
Okay, great, and thank you. And looks like our next question is from Jim, and he wants to know, how does one train to change conflict behavior? For example, one who has a preference to practice avoidance.
How does one? Well, you could sort of almost take conflict out of that question and ask, how does one change behavior? And part of the starting point for any behavioral change is a motivation to change, and then a mechanism to identify what that change process looks like. Richard Boyatzis, who's one of the change gurus out of Case Western Reserve University, talks about establishing your ideal vision. And I think that's a useful technique for stepping forward and looking back at, well, what do you want this behavior to look like if you change it, and then to deconstruct the changes that you've made along the way to get there. So I think starting out with understanding what it is you want and providing a particular path and mechanism for supporting your change, but certainly at the beginning one needs to be motivated to change, otherwise it's unlikely to produce any positive results. At least that's in my experience.
Okay, great, thank you. And our next question is coming from Brian, and he says, can you provide additional examples of process-related conflict?
Yes. I think accountability is a process-related conflict, and quite a big one. Not knowing who's ultimately accountable for things, and can throw up some particular issues, and who's responsible for certain tasks are also. So accountability and responsibility, I would say, are quite big. I think uneven workloads are quite a frequent source of process-related conflict as well. And that brings a level of tension into play that might otherwise not be there. And so I think those two things, accountability and responsibility, and uneven workflow, would be two examples of conflict in a process conflict that I would cite.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And Martin, would you like to add any final thoughts?
I would. Naturally, I hope that you all felt time today was beneficial, and I certainly look forward to responding to the questions that I know have come in that we didn't have time to get to today. Sarah, I want to thank you for your expert moderation, as usual. And again, to everyone who took part today, I thank you for your time and your interest.
All right, great. And Martin, thank you again, and a big thanks to everybody who attended. And you can always check us out on HRDQ-U.com, and you can register for our upcoming webinars every Wednesday. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.
Did you stop the webinar? Stop recording?